Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Anderson Acres. Today we're in the kitchen because I got a couple of comments that related to, well, one, do I ever do anything other than look after the animals? The answer is yes, of course I do. One of the things I do is bake. I know that sounds cliche. Farm girl looks after animals all day, bakes all night. Yeah, okay, but I love to bake. It's pretty much my favorite thing ever. The other thing is, in one of my videos, you see one of my sons walk past with a croissant, and I made a comment about a croissant I made. It was an offhand comment, but somebody asked me if I actually made those croissants and if I could share the recipe. I'm not going to make croissants today. That's an all-day affair, usually actually 2 or 3 days the way I make them. But I am going to make some basic white bread, so everyone can just see how I make it. It's really, really easy. It's a really simple recipe. Now, I'm going to use a bread maker to mix the dough just because I don't have a lot of time today. But I often, very often, make it when I'm kneading. I sit here at the counter and it takes quite a while, but I enjoy the process when I have the time. Today I do not have the time. So if I were going to knead by hand, what I would do is I would take this water here. It's warm, okay? It is not cold, but it's also not hot. If it was hot, it would kill the yeast. And I would mix in the sugar, which is about 1 tablespoon. I would mix that into that water. And this, in particular, sorry for jamming the camera like that, this is actually bread machine yeast. If I were doing it by hand, I would use my traditional yeast. So after I mix the sugar into the warm water, I would sprinkle my traditional yeast on top, let that sit for about 5 minutes till it was frothy. Then I would mix all the ingredients, do the kneading, and so on. I'm not going to do that today. I really, really do not have the time. So instead, I'm going to use my bread maker. My bread maker is quite simple. It's just a bread pan. Here's the mixing paddle. You take your mixing paddle, place it correctly in your pan, and you are ready to go. When you're using a bread maker, you add your ingredients in a specific order. So first you add your water, 1 cup of warm water, again not hot, 1 cup. You would add about 1 tablespoon of sugar, just regular white sugar. You don't want to add more than that because your bread will end up really sweet. The sweetness of store-bought bread is why my kids really don't eat it. They'll only eat bread I made. You also want to do 1 teaspoon, thereabouts, of salt. I'm using Himalayan pink salt because my son is pretty convinced that it is the best salt on the planet. He loves it. Sorry, there's a chip on there and I keep thinking it's a hair. It's not. But he loves Himalayan pink salt, so that's pretty much all I buy. You can use table salt, you can use sea salt, it doesn't really matter. Tristan just likes Himalayan salt. You also want 2 or 3 tablespoons of butter. I use butter, not margarine, not oil in this recipe. I will use oils if I'm making an Italian or a French bread, but I do not use anything but butter in my basic white bread. So now that you have your water, your salt, your sugar, and your fat, in this case butter, I then take 3 cups of just regular white flour. It's really pretty flour. Let's try not to, not to miss the bread pan. Would be good. I always miss a little bit. I usually am not this organized when baking. I just didn't want to have the entire video be me running around the kitchen getting flour, which is what usually happens. So you give this a little bit of a shake so that you can see your flour completely covers your water. And the reason you want to do that is because you don't want your yeast to mix into the flour, to the water, sorry. So you sprinkle the yeast on top of that flour. Sorry, my dish was a little bit damp because I had already used them today. So this is bread machine yeast. It does not need to be dissolved. It's completely fine to use it like just the way out of the jar. Traditional yeast should be dissolved for full effect. So it really just depends what yeast you're using and why. So then you take your bread pan. Let me just go over here. This is my little bread maker. It's a Star Fret. Oh, bang, I keep forgetting. But there's a counter there. So it's really easy to use, simple bread maker. You don't have to spend a lot. I don't typically bake inside the bread maker. I only use it to mix the dough, just because I'm short on time some days. So my bread maker, you put the pan in and then rotate it clockwise to lock it in. Now it's stuck, but you have to follow the directions on your bread maker, okay? Because pans go in differently. I've had bread makers where you just push it in and pull it out. If I do that with this one, it'll break. So now I select cycle 7 because, as you can see, cycle 7 is dough. And I'm not going to bake it in the bread maker. I'm just going to make dough. So you can look inside there. It's mixing up nice. And we'll come back in a few minutes to check on the actual dough. And I'm not going to have you watch all of the rising and all of the mixing and all of the baking because we'd be here for 4 hours. So, back in a few. All right, we are back after a few minutes of mixing, 7 minutes exactly, and that's how the dough looks. It should look just about like that. If it's too dry, you want to add water at about a tablespoon at a time. If it's too wet, you want to add flour at about 1/8 of a cup at a time. If you exceed those numbers, if you add 2 tablespoons of water at a time, you may end up with a dough that is really, really wet, and then you have to add flour, and it turns into this whole pancake mix ordeal where you can't get it quite the right consistency. So you want it to look like that when you're mixing. We'll come back in a few minutes to look at what it should look like when it's done kneading. It's in a kneading phase right now, and it's looking quite good. This machine works really well. I prefer the machines with a single paddle for kneading. It's the only thing that gets it even close to the consistency that I get it to when I'm kneading by hand. So we'll come back in just a few minutes. So the bread has finished its kneading cycle. On this particular machine, it's a 20-minute kneading cycle, which is about what you would do if you were kneading it by hand. You know, you would take about 10 minutes to mix the bread and 5 to 10 minutes for kneading. So it's comparable in time, except I don't have to do it myself. I'll just take the dough out for a minute and let you see what it looks like. This is what it should look like when you're done kneading. Just about like that. If you heard that ticking sound, that was just the bread maker pre-warming so it can rise. So if you had done this by hand, what you would now do is oil a bowl, lightly oil. You don't want it swimming in oil, just you don't want it sticking. And you would put it in that bowl, cover it with a damp cloth, and I would usually put it in the microwave to rise. In this case, I don't have to oil anything because this is a non-stick pan. I just place it back in the bread maker. Close the lid. Sorry about that beep. That's the oven preheating for something else I'm making. So we close the lid. Now we wait about 1 hour and 10 minutes before it's done rising. When this machine tells me that it's finished, we will come back and take a look at the dough, see if it's ready. See you in an hour. And welcome back. The bread maker has just beeped to let me know that it is done rising. So we're just going to open this up and check. Now you want your dough to have risen to about double its original size. And it looks like it has. Just to double check, you just take your fingers, give it a quick press. Oh yes, it looks perfect. So we're just going to take this dough out of here. Just in one piece, we're going to come over here. This is my silicone mat. I love silicone mats quite a lot because they're non-stick, they're easy to clean. This one has circles and measurements so I can make sure to get the size I need when I'm rolling out cookie doughs and such. But for right now, I don't need it, I just like it. So, to shape your dough, you want to push the air bubbles out. You don't want to use a rolling pin because you don't want to completely flatten the air bubbles. And kind of pull it so it's kind of a square. You don't need it to be a square. It's not that big a deal. And I have 2 different kinds of bread pans here. I have the glass bread pan and I have the silicone ones. I prefer the silicone ones, but you can use the glass ones if you like. It doesn't really matter. You don't even have to put it in a pan. You can shape it and put it on a cookie sheet or whatever. You do not need a bread pan, but when you're pressing your dough out, I'm not going to use the glass, I'm going to use this one, just kind of set the dish there and kind of press it so it's maybe a little wider or just as wide as the pan. So once you've done that, we're going to start rolling it up. This kind of gives you nice flaky layers. You're not going to put any butter or anything on it. You're just going to roll it. Pinch this seam closed. Just like that. No big deal. You're going to pinch your ends closed. Now, you're going to put this seam side down in the pan. So keep your seam up and pull these and fold them over so your seam ends up here. So again, pinch this closed. You might be able to see better on this end. And then you kind of just pull this up and over. Okay? And kind of pinch. Now you don't have anything in there except the bread dough, but rolling it like that gives you a nice shape, nice layers in your final product. Now, I like to use a cooking spray. Even though it's silicone, it doesn't stick. A little bit of cooking spray in the pan never hurt anybody. So you just give it a light spritz. This is just a canola oil spray. You can use Pam or any spray you like. You could also use a little bit of butter and flour. I prefer a cooking spray. Place this in. Tuck it in nicely. And you're ready to stick it in the microwave to rise. That's what we're going to do here in a second. And it takes probably about an hour to rise. I put it in the microwave because it's a warm, humid spot where it won't deflate and it won't become dry. That's the thing. You don't want this to dry out. You also don't want to mess with it a lot. If you are using a silicone pan, what you might want to do is take a cookie sheet and place this on the cookie sheet. That way, when you take it out of the microwave and put it into the oven, it stays nice and neat and you don't end up with it bulging and you don't end up popping your risen dough just because you start messing with this. I just like to do that. It also makes it so much easier to take it in and out of the oven later. But we'll come back in about an hour and see how this has risen up. Talk to you in about an hour. All right, so our dough has finished rising. It is about double the size of what it was, and it looks fantastic. It'll continue to rise while it's in the oven. So we're just going to stick it in the oven here. I use these silicone gloves, by the way, because they're just safer for me. I'm just going to stick this in the oven like so. We're going to cook it at 400 degrees Fahrenheit for about 20 minutes. You can do 375 for 25 minutes. That's fine too. It doesn't matter that much. Bread is kind of forgiving when it comes to baking. And it'll just puff up, look pretty. And we'll come back in 20 minutes and see what we have. So it has been 22 minutes actually since I put the bread in the oven. Let's take a look, shall we? See, I told you it would continue to rise. It looks quite gorgeous. See, when you roll it the way I did, instead of just shaping it into a log and sticking it in, it actually doesn't bubble over on the sides. See, it just stays nice and neat. Turning the oven off, just because we don't need it on anymore, and I'll turn off the oven light. Now, before you put your bread in the oven, you can put a coating on it. So you can coat it with water to give you a crispy crust. You can coat it with egg white to give it a shiny crust. Or you can coat it with milk to give it a softer crust. I didn't do any of that because I am going to brush it with melted butter. I love butter. Butter makes it better. Why wouldn't we use butter? So we just take our basting brush and brush all the exposed area. Let it run down. Let it look good. Don't miss any spots. Tasty, tasty. We love butter. Now you're going to want to let your bread sit a good 20 minutes before you even try to cut it. Even if you like hot bread, you want to let it sit. Now, I ideally let it sit 20 minutes in this pan. Then I take it out and let it cool for a further 20 minutes before I even think of cutting it. Except I have a dog who loves fresh bread and he's going to bother me while we wait. But you don't have to see that part. He's just going to irritate me for a while. Now, when you're using your basting brush, you want to have different basting brushes for different purposes. So if I had used this basting brush for, say, barbecue sauce, it's possible that it would carry a flavor and would impart that flavor into my butter. I use one basting brush for butter, one basting brush for sweet items, and one basting brush for savory items. So I have at least 3 basting brushes. I actually have more like 6. Probably 8, to be honest. You can never have enough basting brushes. You need them. But use a nice basting brush, nice clean basting brush that hasn't been used for a ton of different foods. And you'll get a nice shiny glaze. So we'll come back in about 20 minutes to turn it out of the pan. I want it to maintain its shape. So I'm going to leave it for 20 minutes before I take it out of that pan. See you in a few. All right, so 20 minutes have passed. The bread is cooling, but not quite cool. So we're just going to take it out of the mold, nice and gentle. There we go. I like to leave it on its side. It is still soft and pliable, so I'm going to leave it actually another 20 minutes before I cut it. By then, my children will be almost home, and I'm sure they'll start devouring it at a moment's notice. So tune in. A few minutes from now, we will absolutely cut the bread, and you can see what it looks like inside. Now that's a beautiful loaf, all ready for cutting. It's been cooling for 30 to 40 minutes, 20 minutes in the pan, and then 10 to 20 minutes outside the pan. It makes it easier to cut because it's a little more solid, not quite so prone to collapsing on you because it's hot. So it is still quite warm. You can feel how warm it is. I know you can't. You're looking through a camera. But I'm going to cut it now. Now I'm going to use an electric knife. This knife is only ever used for bread. I do not use it to cut meat or anything else. I suggest that you do have 2 electric knives, one for bread products, one for your meats and other products you might use an electric knife for. I will apologize in advance for the sound. It's going to be quite loud. I will replace the audio if I can. I should be able to, but you never know. Sometimes my video editor has a little tantrum. So if I can replace the audio while you're watching this and listening to the horrific sound of the cutter, excellent. You can cut your slices any size you want, by the way. You can do about like that, which is what I'm going to do. You could do thinner. You could do thicker. It's up to you. If I was making French toast with this, I would go a little bit thicker, but I'm just going to go about here and then try to keep them consistent. Here we go. Yay! Horrible sound edited out. I do want to quickly mention that you should let your blade come to a complete rest before you start cutting the next slice. This just protects you from injury and it cuts your bread nicer. And it's just a good idea. It gives you a little bit more control. Actually, it gives you quite a lot more control. Look at how soft that bread looks. Isn't it delightful? You can sort of see the swirl from where we rolled the bread, but they're quite warm. You could smear butter on them if you like, and it will melt beautifully. But that's how you make a standard white bread. No difficulties at all. Perfectly cooked and delicious. Tune in later to find out more about our animals and maybe to see me bake something else. We'll see what I'm in the mood for recording a little bit later. In the meantime, have a good afternoon, and if you'd like to see more recipes, I will link my blog where I have some of the recipes that I use. It's Baking with Flair. You'll find the link in the description. You can also subscribe and maybe see some more videos of baking. I do intend to show you some of the baking I do for animals. I make horse treats and dog snacks and a variety of other things. So hopefully we'll see you later. Have a good night. Bye-bye.